Welcome to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't, a podcast dedicated to helping you create the relationship you truly want.
Intimacy that lasts. Practical ways to keep desire burning. Sex is one of the most common areas where couples quietly struggle and one of the least openly discussed. Improving your sex life often has less to do with technique and more to do with context and communication. Careers are demanding, parenting is exhausting, bodies are changing, and emotional bandwidth can feel limited. Desire doesn't disappear because love is gone. It often gets buried under mental load, weariness, or unspoken resentments. What makes this topic especially challenging is the silence around it. Couples frequently wait until frustration, distance, or shame has set in before they talk about what's missing. And when they do, the conversation can feel loaded, vulnerable, or tense. Yet intimacy doesn't improve through avoidance. It improves through understanding, communication, and small intentional shifts. And today's guest to help us explore this important topic, again, is Dr. Rebecca Howard-Udy, certified sex therapist, licensed mental health counselor in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. She is certified also in EFT, which I love. She specializes in helping couples navigate desire differences, emotional disconnection, and the complex realities of intimacy during the parenting years. With over a decade of clinical experience, Rebecca combines research-backed approaches with practical tools. She is the co-host of the podcast, The Love Lab Uncensored, and has a new podcast called Under the Hood. She co-hosts with a pelvic floor PT. And we all are learning a lot about pelvic floors. So she's right there in the cultural zeitgeist. Her first book, Parents in Love, A Guide to Great Sex After Kids, was recently published. Thanks for being here again, Rebecca.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm so happy to be back with you.
In our previous episode, number 155, you defined a difference in desire as an ordinary situation. You said those with less desire have to improve their willingness. So what if someone is unwilling and believes they've aged past having a sex life? And is there truth to people aging out? And part 2, remind my audience how to create more willingness, because I thought that was really important.
Yeah. So, the research doesn't really support that people age out of having great sex.
That's what I thought.
Actually, there's some really compelling research that was done. There's a great book. It's called Magnificent Sex by Peggy Kleinplatz. And are you familiar with that?
No, but I love it. Nobody talks about books, and so I'm a big... Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I love her. So she has done this really amazing research, long-term study. So the book is based on her own research, and she talks to couples about what makes what she calls magnificent sex. So this is like exceptional sexual encounters. And in her research, actually, that skews to older folks are much more likely to say that they're having magnificent sex. And a lot of what makes sex magnificent, she goes through and has like 5 or 6 different factors in common that people talk about. But one of the big ones is connection.
Yes. And there's something about that aging and there's more room for each other is one way I would describe it. Mm-hmm. And there's more softness, I think, towards each other because you've got more perspective and you really can hear things that are hard, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. With that said, I have definitely worked with couples, whether it's younger couples or whether it's couples who are aging, where there's a really good reason, often a physical reason. Sometimes it's something like pregnancy. Other times it's something like aging bodies, like perimenopause or menopause, or As men tend to age, their erections tend to be less reliable. So something that's preventing them from being able to have sex in the same way that they did, maybe in their 20s when it was like easy. We say, oh, it's so easy back then. And so one of the things that does keep people engaged and having great sex long term through the course of a relationship is being flexible, having a really broad definition of what sex is. Because, we'll get into this, I'm sure, later in the episode, but if we define sex as just intercourse, then that is limiting for many times in the lifespan. And it's also limiting, at any time, because there's so much more to a sexual connection than just one way of having sex.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you. How does feeling emotionally seen and appreciated affect sexual desire?
Well, I think that goes also to the sort of second part of your first question about willingness. Because when there's that emotional connection, it's not true always that being really emotionally close with somebody and really being emotionally intimate with someone leads to sexual desire. I mean, many of us have very intimate relationships with friends or family where there's no sexual desire at all. However, in a romantic relationship, having the space to feel like your partner is your friend, like they've got your back, like they're gonna try to understand you, as opposed to sort of being that litigation attorney who's like, show me how this makes sense. They're your defense attorney. They're like, all right, let's work with what we've got. Let's figure this out together. And so that being emotionally seen does lead to more desire. And sometimes that can actually come up as talking about what's getting in the way of your desire and being able to do that more openly if you're more emotionally seen and connected. And then that also leads to more willingness.
Any other tips for willingness?
I think that willingness is something that is not on the surface of it all that sexy. It's like we kind of are like, willingness. I mean, yeah, isn't that just a given? But for folks who have more responsive desire, which is more the case as bodies age, and certainly more the case as testosterone drops, whether that's in a male or a female person. If they have less testosterone, they're going to have less spontaneous desire.
That's right.
And so as you have more responsive desire, that sexual cycle does not start with desire, if that makes sense. I just said desire a lot, but it doesn't start with that feeling of, I really want to have sex.
Yes.
It starts with willingness.
Yeah, and that comes first. And something about being open to it, not closed down, tight, more open.
Exactly. And sometimes willingness actually looks like I'm just willing to see what happens. I'm willing to be flexible with myself, that I don't actually really feel all that sexual in this moment, but I'm willing to believe that if I put myself in that position, I might be. And so that willingness, when you start with that, there's typically not arousal happening. There's maybe not even desire. Maybe desire to be close to your partner, maybe desire to see where things go. But with responsive desire, and when we're talking about starting from a place of willingness, we really are talking about being open to possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a little bit of a mental shift, because a lot of times it's much more, we kind of want to start with that va-va-voom, like, oh, I really want to have sex with you. That's an easier place to start sometimes than the willingness.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's what it shows in TV, the va-va-voom,
Exactly.
It's so easy, too. And there's never any awkwardness, rarely, and everything's wonderful. And everybody orgasms at the same time,
Yeah,
it's
that's
amazing. Right. I'm certain that everyone's favorite excuse for avoiding sex is, I'm too tired. What can we do when we're emotionally interested in sex, but physically exhausted?
Yeah, I hear this from clients all the time. And the thing that I often hear from clients when we really dive into this a little bit more is that they'll say, I really was interested in sex at like 10 a.m. this morning for like 20 minutes. And then you weren't there. And so by, 10 p.m., they're less interested or really so exhausted that the idea of being sexual is just like the furthest thing from what they want to do. So this is legitimate, especially if we're talking about parenthood, especially if there's, in the early days when kids aren't sleeping, sleep comes first. So if you're actually not sleeping, this is totally legit. But for a lot of people, whether they have kids or not, many of us lead lives that are so overwhelming and busy that we're sort of in this perpetual state of exhaustion. And, this is sort of I think that can come off as sounding like do better, which is not how I mean it at all. But we need to look at what our choices are. So if we're perpetually in a state of exhaustion, we need to look at, I'm saying we because I include myself in this. I am often in this camp of I need to look at what are my choices? What did I say yes to? Did someone ask me to do something and it sounded kind of fun, or I really felt like I couldn't say no, or, all of my kids' friends are doing a million sports and I say yes, 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 yes. And then I'm exhausted and there's no room for anything else. And it's not just sex, because if you're too exhausted for sex, then you probably, what that tells me is that you're probably also not doing that self-care, because we have to be able to take care of ourselves. Sexual desire comes from a place of self-love. And so if we're not caring for and loving ourselves and feeling attracted to ourselves and attractive in our own bodies, then that also shuts down desire as well.
Yeah. I remember when one of the PTA women, I don't know what they call it anymore, but they called me up and asked me to do something. And I just said, there's a lot of women in this neighborhood that don't work, and I'm working, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to say no. And I'm sure nobody says no, but I felt, and I didn't feel guilty about it. I really felt like I am making a choice, and I know this isn't an answer you usually hear, but it does matter. You have to think about your energy and where you're putting it and what your priorities are and what your choices are. And we can't do it all.
No, we can't. We can't. And, I find that I often want to do it all. There's some things that people ask me to do or opportunities or whatever that come my way, and I'm like, I really don't want to do that. Those things are a little bit easier, I find, to say no to, the ones that I really don't want to do. It's when I really want to do something, and, which is a lot of things. I really want to do a lot of things, or I want a lot of things for my kids. And so I have tried to start saying, let me think about it. Maybe let me look at my calendar. And then I really check in about what my bandwidth is, because, sometimes, yeah, I really do want to do it. But other times I really want to do it. And it's the cost of it is going to feel like it's too high.
And I like that pause so you can really make a choice. That's
right.
Yeah. And reminding people there are choices, that we seem to forget about. So I believe that sex is something that couples talk the least about, right up there with money. It's so difficult to talk about because we're afraid of hurting each other's feelings or creating pressure, which is counterproductive. Are there ways to make it easier to talk about sex, or ways that make it worse? And what can we do to help my audience decide talking about it matters, especially if years have piled up with not talking about it at all?
Yeah. So couples who have great sex talk about sex way more than they have it.
Oh, and I bet that's a research thing, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
So talking about sex is really, really important. And so when I say that, when we say talking about sex, a lot of times people think, you're going to talk about positions or talk about fantasies or something, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Certainly, if that floats your boat and that's what you want to talk about, go for it. But a lot of times actually talking about sex, especially in a long-term relationship, sounds an awful lot like a scheduling conversation. So it sounds like, when are we going to have sex this week? I really would like to have sex. I'm exhausted tonight. I know we talked about having sex, but could we postpone it till tomorrow? So truly, like some of that talk about sex is just having it be part of the conversation, just normalizing it in a way where we can share where we're at, how we're feeling, what we want. And certainly, like a pleasure based conversation is wonderful too. Sharing fantasies, talking about novelty, talking about missing each other, wanting to find time to connect. But it doesn't have to really be, I mean, this can be sort of a G or a PG rated conversations. And I love text messages for this. So I suggest that couples, if they are feeling like they really would like to be connected with their partner. They're feeling really sexual at 10 a.m. and they're at work and their partner's at work, or, there's no chance that they're actually going to have an encounter. Sharing those feelings and those thoughts, even if they're gone by 10 p.m., what that does is it makes it part of the conversation and makes it something that it's like, I'm thinking of you. You're thinking of me. I miss you. You miss me. We're in this together. That keeps the sexual spark alive as well.
And I like the idea of making it more ordinary. That's really important. That it can't be this big ta-dum, ta-dum, like, oh my God, we're going to talk about it once a year and we're going to figure things out. That's great. Besides how sex is shown in television and movies, why do so many of us not understand that orgasm from intercourse is only experienced by 70 to 80% of women? And you might have a more accurate figure about that. What else do we need to know about this? Because I consider it really important to educate people on it.
Yeah. So there's a ton of different statistics out there, depending on what research you look at. That's as accurate as any. That's actually on the low end of what I've heard. Some other studies show that being higher. And one of the statistics that I really like is that, so Lori Mintz in her book, Becoming Clitorate, which is also an amazing resource. It's all about the clitoris. And, not only sort of the mechanics, but also the cultural, learning and understanding and everything about it. But some of her research shows that only 99% of women, when they masturbate, do not use any sort of penetrative, they're not using a toy or anything like that. They're using a vibrator, and they're exclusively using clitoral stimulation. So that tells us something really powerful about where the center of female pleasure is. And so I find that understanding this is really, so imagine a world in which all of the movies and TV show the ultimate in male pleasure. The way that you have sex is fondling balls.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the thing.
Yeah.
Right. So it's all about the testicles all the time. It's all about the ball. We have excessive ball fondling, right? And this is funny. Like, honestly, every time I say it, I have a little giggle. But true. And the poor guy's like trying to get his penis in there and like, could you rub, But that's what we're doing to the clitoris.
You're flipping the script. Yes.
Yeah. And how outrageous is that? But the clitoris and the penis are anatomical counterparts.
Yes, they are. And people still don't realize that.
No, they don't. And, I think that, which is not to say that penetrative sex is not really pleasurable. We're not here to say good, bad, anything like that. But for the majority of women, the clitoris has got to be involved. And for a lot of women, it's actually more difficult to orgasm during penetrative sex. And so figuring out how everybody is getting their needs met, I mean, that is when we're talking about like aging and great sex long term, it's essential to be able, orgasm every time does not have to happen for great sex, but it's got to be a possibility, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. How do people rebuild intimacy when they feel more like roommates than lovers? Because I think that happens to a lot of people.
It does. It does happen to a lot of people. And, I think that goes back to your earlier question about talking about sex. I think that when couples start to feel like roommates, it's when they stop talking about sex.
Oh.
It's something that becomes a little bit of a taboo subject. Like they're just ignoring that is part of their relationship. And sometimes it's ignoring because it's, been so long. Sometimes it's ignoring because one person has sort of a lower desire than the other, or, for whatever reason, it starts to become kind of awkward to talk about. Because the people that I know, even if they're not having a lot of sex, if they're talking about it and there's a reason that they're not having a lot of sex and they're open and they're communicating about it, they're not going to tell me that they feel like roommates. They're going to tell me that they're in a low sex period of their relationship, and there's a good reason for that.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I would say the communication, spending time talking about it, even if it's talking about not having sex,
Missing
still
it.
talking about sex,
Or
missing
not
it.
missing it. And being more specific, what do you miss and what do you not miss? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I will say that this feeling of feeling like roommates is really, really common. And if you're in a period of time in your relationship where communication about sex has decreased, or, sexual contact has decreased for whatever reason, part of the other thing that makes people feel like roommates is when the romantic touch is also gone. Because we have sexual touch, but then we also have the sensual touch, hug, kiss, these moments that we share only with our romantic partners. And so I think that if that's sort of the climate of the relationship, that feeling of roommates, if you start outside the bedroom first and focus on those micro moments of connection. So what that could look like is, sweeping your hand across your partner's back as you pass them. When you come in the door or go out of the door, actually putting down the phone, looking at each other, saying a nice hello, a goodbye, sharing a hug that involves like a big deep breath, or even something like as simple as just sort of catching eyes across the craziness of the kitchen or, wherever you are, and actually having a moment where it feels like you're sort of on the same team. So those little moments, the Gottmans talk about that a lot. They talk about the small things often that then end up warming up the whole climate of the relationship. And even if there's less sex in the relationship, if the climate of the relationship feels really warm, it's much less likely to fall into that sort of roommate trap.
Yes. What I was just thinking about, if people are not talking about sex, particularly men, I think, porn, OnlyFans, those sideways avenues. What are your thoughts about that? Because I understand, my impression is from the younger men is that has gotten to be problematic. I don't know much about it, though.
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with porn or even OnlyFans. The thing about OnlyFans
I meant
is that
the percentage of the majority of sexual pleasure comes from that is really, yeah.
Yes, then that can be problematic.
Yes.
So I would say that it's problematic if it's problematic in your relationship. The trick with some of the OnlyFans and, even sort of like the live porn, it can feel more like a betrayal because it is a little bit more personal. It's not just watching a pre-recorded video. So if it's paid content, if you're subscribing, if you're in a partnered relationship and your partner doesn't know about that, that can be really problematic because it can feel like akin to an affair. It can feel like a betrayal. So that can be really problematic. And I think that, when there's less sexual contact in a relationship and when the relationship does get less sexual, I think that it's normal to turn to porn and to turn to self-pleasure and fantasy as a way, because humans are sexual beings. And so if that's not a problem in your relationship, then I wouldn't say that it's a problem. I think that when it becomes problematic is if your partner is, not, if it's really hidden. And I don't mean that you have to share everything that you're doing, because the solo sex life is solo, for a reason. There's nothing wrong with privacy, but privacy and secrecy are different. So if there's a lot of secrecy, then that can be problematic. And then the other time that it can be really problematic is if in the relationship it becomes an issue. So for instance, if you have a partner who wants to be more sexual and your primary sexual outlet is through solo pleasure, masturbation, and porn, then that can really be an issue. It can be detrimental. And it is more common for this to happen with men than women. Actually, women tend to have, research has shown that women who have a more active solo self-pleasure life are more likely to have a more active and satisfactory partnered sex life. Where men, so they have sort of like a complementary model, where men are more likely to engage more in their solo sex life when they're having less sex in other parts of their life. And so that can be problematic at times.
Okay. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah. What happens when one partner expects sex to fix emotional distance while the other needs emotional safety or connection first?
Yeah, great question. And I love the way you phrased it. So if you're using sex to fix emotional connection, then we have a lack of range and a lack of flexibility in how we connect. And the same thing, if it's absolutely you're really struggling to connect through sexual contact, and only using emotional connection as the way that you connect, then that also is not as flexible. And so both sex and emotional intimacy, so both sexual intimacy and emotional intimacy are intimacy. And so ideally, we would want to be able to connect in both ways. The reality is that some people feel like really a lot more open to being emotionally intimate after they've been sexually intimate. Uh-huh. And some people feel like their emotional intimacy is really the gateway in to being able to be sexual. So there's nothing that's wrong with that. But depending on what side of that fence you're on, mm-hmm. you're likely going to be initiating more of the type of contact that you prefer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it can get into a little bit of a stalemate situation when couples will say to each other, well, if we were more emotionally connected, I'd want to have sex. Well, if we had sex more, I'd be open to, being more emotionally connected. And so that's kind of like, it can start to feel like each person is refusing to meet the other person where they're at. And that can be problematic. So we want to just sort of try to increase our range. There is a bit of a gender divide here, that there's like sort of a licensed language situation where men tend to be less coaching, less, sort of competency in the emotional realm. They struggle more to express their feelings. It's not because they have less feelings. It's because they don't have the words for it. And I think that this is changing somewhat, but as boys and men, they're not encouraged to have a lot of more of those squishy, vulnerable feelings. It's kind of like winning and sex and anger. That's like all they get.
And I hadn't thought about the trifecta there, but you're right. Yeah.
And whereas women do get a lot of coaching around being good friends and being there for others and having emotional competency. And so they're much more comfortable often being emotionally connected. And women tend to get a lot of very complicated, very contradictory messages about what it means to be a sexual being in a female body. And so that can be a really challenging place to be able to express desire, to be able to connect, because there can be a lot of shame, there can be a lot of guilt, and it can just feel really tricky.
Yeah, that's right. I would agree. How can mismatched expectations around initiation create resentment or rejection in a relationship? I put that in the script because I was thinking that initiation question and the habits around that have got to get stuck in places.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I think it can be really tricky when, with anything. If you're initiating something and you feel like you're alone, if I'm always the one who's unloading the dishwasher and my partner never unloads the dishwasher, if I'm always the one who's asking for sex, or always the one who's bringing up issues in the relationship, or always the one who's planning the dates or taking care of the kids, I can start to feel unsupported and alone. And that leads to resentment. And so, I think that different people naturally in relationships tend to hold different initiation energies. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you start to end up feeling like you're the only one who's asking for closeness in that area or who's initiating in that area, then that's when it can start to cause that resentment.
And I think bringing it up as a topic today is also asking people to consider that being able to talk about initiation and what are the habits and what gets in the way and do we want to play with it a little bit. So I think that just adds to the conversations we can have about sex at home.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that what is really important to acknowledge is that any sort of initiation, whether it's initiating a difficult emotional conversation or whether it's asking for sex, any sort of initiation, interviewing for a new job, it's a risk. It's vulnerable. Anytime we ask for something that we want, we put ourselves out there, we risk getting hurt. And that's not to say that if your partner risks and initiates, you have to say yes. No, of course not. But many of us, especially in long-term relationships, get out of the habit of looking at that as a risk. And so then we end up either if we're the one doing the initiation or whether our partner's doing the initiation, we end up feeling rejected. And that is really painful. It can be really painful. And I hear people talk about, their sort of wounds around rejection that often predate the relationship. And so one of the things to really keep in mind is to treat any sort of initiation with a lot of respect and gratitude. Even if it's like, so if your partner says, initiate sex and you're just really not in the mood, you're exhausted, saying something like, I really want to have sex. I would really like to get into a place where I am ready to have sex with you. I'm not there right now, but please ask again. The please ask again, I think, is an important thing. I'm not in a place where I can have that conversation right now, but please ask again. Or could we talk about this later? Could I see you tomorrow? So something that makes it more about you, because a lot of times when we say no, whether it's to a conversation or to a sexual initiation, it does tend to be much more about an internal state, whether it's exhaustion or not feeling good in our own body or not feeling competency in a certain area, feeling like we're going to let our partner down. Like there's a lot of different things that can cause us to say no, but mostly it's not about the other person.
That's right. That's right. Yes. And fortune favors the bold might be something to try to keep that. Taking risks really is important, and that it changes your life the more you can face that uncertainty and step out there into it. My youngest grandson didn't want to do boys club at Chautauqua this year, and we all talked him into it, and he was pretty unhappy about it. And I just gave him a picture this weekend. They pick one kid in the group that is the super grouper, and you get a crown, and I think you get $1. And he did it, and I wanted him to remember that moment because he didn't want to go and he was afraid, but he stepped into it and he was the super grouper for like 12 kids or something. So it's so important to take those risks, but that's why I made a picture of it, because I didn't want him to forget how important it is to take that risk. And I think thinking about taking risks with conversations. And, I feel like I've been the person that's initiated all the time, and I'd really like to share that and experience it in a different way. And I've been okay with it. I'm not complaining. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, can we play with this and make it a little bit different? Because we have a habit, and sex and novelty go together, a little bit. So the brain loves novelty at any rate. Are there any other expectations, like housework not being shared or frequency, that we could address that impact sex lives?
What a great question. Yes, absolutely. I want to say one more thing about initiation.
Oh, sure.
If that's okay. So one of the things is when we're young, I think about your grandson. I think about people in their 20s, in their teens. They're constantly doing new things. They're asking people out. They're starting and ending relationships. They're going to school. They're starting new jobs. And it's an anxious time. A lot of times there's a lot of turmoil. There's excitement. There's anxiety. And so but then when we get into middle age, often we have this period of time where we're settled. We have our life as it is. And what also happens around that time is that a lot of people find themselves in a bit of a vulnerability desert. They're not as connected to themselves or to other people. And so initiation, taking risks, is what makes us feel alive. It's what makes us kind of like, you have to put yourself out there and be vulnerable in order to have connection with other people. And so it's just like that piece is so incredibly important. And I love that story about your grandson, where it's like he did this thing that was really hard. Hey, aren't those hard things that much more meaningful? And then it turned out well. And you wanted him to have this visual of this crown on his head. How amazing is that? Because what that does is it makes his internal model of himself as someone who can do hard things, and then he ends up with a crown on his head.
Yes.
And I think that we often stop thinking of ourselves as that way of going after what we want and feeling connected and alive and vulnerable in our lives. But it does make us sort of, get caught in the doldrums a little bit, I would say.
And we value comfort too much. I had a client in her late 70s, and her sister had died, and she came in and she was pretty upset about her sister, but she said, "Don't ever get a recliner." My sister never left her recliner, and it was just the sweetest thing. But I think we do. Comfort is too highly prized, particularly in American culture, I think. Even avoiding dialogue between red states and blue states right now. Avoiding that dialogue because it's more comfortable to only be in our silo of our opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that does lead into your question of around this resentment and how do we navigate these household tasks. And this is huge, because the reality is that, especially with kids, but even if you don't have kids, life has to happen, and life is sometimes mundane. That we have to do the same thing over and over again. Routine, consistency, all of this is really important. And so one of the things that can happen with couples is that one person ends up holding all of this mental load, and then it causes a lot of that resentment building. It's like they start to feel like, how could I even think about what I wanted, because I'm so enmeshed in holding all of this stuff for everybody else. And so I do think that can really have a lot of resentment. One of the traps, and I think that this, it's not exactly comfort, but it's control. Comfort is control. We want to stay where we're nice and cozy and comfortable. And sometimes what that can look like, particularly in a family situation, is that the person who's responsible for all of that mental load also has a very particular way that they want things done. And so they have trouble accepting help because the people who might help them might not do it the way that they want. But that doesn't mean that they're any less resentful about having to carry that mental load.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. So I mentioned novelty in the brain a moment ago. Does novelty matter for desire, and how can couples create it without pressure or embarrassment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that it varies by individual. So some people have a brain that just constantly craves novelty. Some people, they just really feel alive on novelty. And other people are really happy and content with a lot of routine, and that's something that makes them feel really good. And so there's nothing wrong with either one of those things. In general, novelty is sort of the spice of life. And so even if a person who doesn't crave as much novelty, having some novelty, and that doesn't need to be crazy, right? Like we don't need to talk about like really big novelty, right? Like acting out fantasies or adding new people in, or, some couples that may be what they do. They get kind of kinky and it works really well for them. But even just going away for a weekend and being in a hotel room in a different situation than your own bedroom is novelty.
Mm-hmm.
Going out to eat at a new restaurant is novelty. Thinking about something that you want to do together that you haven't done. Maybe you usually, I don't know, like maybe you do usually do like the New York Times crossword by yourself, and you invite your partner to do it with you. That's novelty.
That's right. And again, it's about those small intentional moments that can change things, and thinking about them and playing with your choices that can make things different and better. I like
Yeah,
that.
that's right. That's right.
Does attraction naturally change in long-term relationships, and can it be rekindled?
Yes, it does. And actually, a lot of this does come down to novelty. Because when something's new, it's like a bright, shiny new toy. We get really excited about it. We don't have to try so hard for the novelty. Because, one of the things that novelty does is it kind of gives, if we have success in novelty, it gives us kind of that dopamine hit and we want more of that. And so in the beginning of a relationship, the dynamics are just different. But also the other thing is that there's more insecurity. And for a lot of people, actually, we talk about how emotional security is important and being connected is important, and important for desire in long-term relationships. That is true. In long-term relationships, it's important to have emotional safety in order to have sex, like good, satisfying sex life long term. Absolutely. However, emotional security is not sexy on its own,
Yeah.
right? It's because we're sharing our life with someone. We need for them to be our friend. We need for them to be understanding. They're our primary attachment figure. We need security from them because we're sharing a life together. That's why it's important in long-term relationships. But in terms of just pure desire, actually insecurity can be something that really sparks desire. That feeling of, ooh, are they going to call me? Are they going to text me? I'm not sure. There's kind of like that insecurity that
Yeah.
can make people really want to be close and feel really intense and raw. And one of the ways that we can get close to somebody is through sex. And so a lot of times when we talk about in the beginning of relationships where there's all of this spontaneous desire and people are having sex all the time, some of that sex, we talk about why do you want to have sex? What's the secondary game there? Sometimes in the beginning of relationships, it can actually be out of an insecurity. We also see this after an affair. A lot of times after an affair, if the couple has decided to stay together, they may start having a lot more sex than they did pre-affair. It doesn't last. We have to build the security, but there can be that fear. If I'm not having sex with you, then you're going to go have sex with someone else. It can be that real strong desire to reconnect. And so I'm not saying that this is something that's healthy in a long-term relationship. I'm not saying it's something for us to strive for, but it is something about how our brains work, is that, that it does change.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. Is there anything else we haven't covered you'd like to add before you remind my audience of the title of your book and your website and podcasts? Plural.
I can't think of anything. Honestly, we have covered so much today.
Yeah, we did. I'm very happy with it.
Yeah.
Okay, tell my audience about your book and both your podcasts and anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is called Parents in Love, A Guide to Great Sex After Kids. There is a lot about parents in there, but actually what it's about is a desire difference in long-term relationships, which the research tells us is an almost guaranteed thing. So even for your listeners who don't have kids, there's a lot in there about both the emotional and sexual cycles outside of the family life. And then I have my newest podcast, the one that I'm currently recording, is called Under the Hood, and it's with my co-host is a pelvic floor physical therapist, and so we dive into all things sex, relationships, pelvic floor. I mean, I am learning so much. I have like a long list of questions for my co-host that I'm, really excited to dig into. So that's been a really fun new project. And then if people want to find me, they can do that on my website, which is just my name. It's RebeccaUdy.com. And I'm also on Instagram. And that's also my name, but with Howard in the middle. So Rebecca Howard Udy on Instagram.
All right. Sex doesn't fade because time passes. It fades when we stop choosing it. Not perfectly, not constantly, but intentionally, even in the middle of busy, imperfect lives. Begin with attention, curiosity, and small moments of connection long before anyone goes to bed. So glad you joined us today. You can find me on Instagram and all social media at Rhoda on Couples. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave a rating and review on iTunes and help get the word out. To learn more or connect with Rhoda, visit therapyideas.net.